Hi there. We've got a lot of information to unpack from all of the spy photos we got for House of the Dragon from their filming in Cornwall this past week. So much so that I've had to split it across multiple videos. The preceding one was about the big Valyrian army camp in the Stepstones set that they built at Kynan's Cove. It's this fully realized thing. There are dozens of extras and guardsmen. This is a whole war scene. We saw Corlys Velaryon at a war council table, along with Daemon Targaryen Matt Smith, who then beat up a messenger like he does in the books. That was all in the preceding video. I had to split this off because it's a whole other discussion unto itself. That these are really high-resolution cameras that they took this with. This is a very detailed photo. We're looking at every single extra person in costume in the war camp. And they're all Valyrian soldiers, except for one. That when we zoomed in on one person, one random guardsman, it's just played by an extra, in the middle of the camp, we looked at their shield and realized that's House Celtigar heraldry. This is the live-action debut of House Celtigar. Their heraldry, any mention of them, they were never mentioned by name. Like the Valyrians, their sigil, their name, was not spoken in the live-action Game of Thrones episodes. Yeah, there's the motion comic histories and lores thing. Those aren't fully official, and not everyone watches those. That if you actually read the A Song of Ice and Fire novels, they do mention so many other vassal houses that they would never have had time to put in Game of Thrones, or that they could have if they hadn't rushed it. But the Valyrians, the Celtigars, the Hightowers are all pretty prominent secondary houses. I mean, Loras and Marjorie's mother is a Hightower. So it's going to be weird when this prequel comes out and some people go, oh, it's a case of remember the new guy. No, this was tying in, the prequel novellas were tying into the books, developing secondary houses that had been mentioned and rounding them out more in a prequel, but they'd been established in the main novels, versus Game of Thrones did nothing to set up the Valyrians and Hightowers, because when they were wrapping up, they didn't know they were going to make a Dance of the Dragons show. I mean, even if they hadn't rushed season 8, they were just, the idea at the time was, oh, the next prequel's going to be Long Night, so maybe we should set up the Night King more. Oh, I guess not that too, so I don't know. But this is the first time we're seeing the Celtigars in live action with their heraldry. It's not a family member, it's a soldier. Their heraldry, as described in the books, is red crabs on a white background. Because House Celtigar rules Claw Island, also known as Crab Island, there's a lot of crabs. We're excited about this not just because they're another house from the novels that we wanted to see, like the Caswells, the Rowans, something like that. They're kind of unique, like the Valyrians. They're another minor Valyrian family who served the Targaryens in exile when they were on Dragonstone after the Doom of Valyria, even before the Targaryen conquest, that they said they had these two vassal houses that settled on neighboring islands and were part of their mini-kingdom there. Here's a block quote from the Fire and Blood prequel anthology book that explains this. Quote, Dragonstone had been the westernmost outpost of Valyrian power for 2 centuries before the conquest. Its location athwart the Gullet, the narrow pass that you need to get into the Blackwater Bay, that its location strategically at the opening of the Gullet gave its lords a stranglehold on Blackwater Bay and enabled both the Targaryens and their close allies, the Valyrians of Driftmark, a lesser house of Valyrian descent, to fill their coffers off the passing trade. Valyrian ships, along with those of another allied Valyrian house, the Celtigars of Claw Isle, dominated the middle reaches of the Narrow Sea, whilst the Targaryens ruled the skies with their dragons. So they've been there since 2 centuries before the conquest, and the Doom was a century before the conquest, so 100 years before Valyria even fell, they were there. That there was just this tiny Valyrian province on the coastal islands in Blackwater Bay off the coast of the mainland. to control the shipping lanes and as trading outposts with the independent Seven Kingdoms. That the Valyrian freehold at its height spanned 3 continents. It ruled half the known world. It was centered in Essos, but they had colonies on the north coast of Sothorios, which is their version of Africa, and they even had these trading outposts on the offshore islands near Westeros. That Dragonstone is considered part of Westeros. It's just in the bay. That after the Doom, but before the Conquest, when there were still independent Seven Kingdoms, even after Valyria had fallen, it wasn't a province of anything anymore. There was just this tiny Targaryen mini-kingdom on these 3 islands, plus a few other smaller rocks that they haven't named. So the Velaryons and the Celtigars were loyal vassal houses to the Targaryens since the Valyria days, since Valyria was at its height. They're close allies since the beginning, and the Velaryons so frequently served as the commanders of the Targaryen fleets, the admirals of their fleets, that the position of master of ships on the Small Council was treated almost as a hereditary office for them. Similarly, the Celtigars were frequently masters of coin, as close, trusted allies of the Targaryens. You make someone you trust in charge of something as important as the money, being the treasurer. That it is unusual, and they do stress this in the books and the show to an extent, it is really unusual that a nobody like Littlefinger managed to work his way up to be master of coin. And they do explain that he was good at it when he was working in the Vale, so he quickly worked up through various offices. He worked at their port at Gulltown, and they needed someone who was good at getting money. And then he got in because his old girlfriend, Lysa, married the hand of the king. So he got through on, he was skilled, but it was still considered unusual, and just a testament to how good he was at getting money. But in normal time periods, typically, during different time periods, different families were in royal favor, depending on the era. And according to the tide of politics, different families rose and fell and rose again, depending on what wars or rebellions there were. You think about it, we're so used to the background detail that when we think of King's Landing, we think of contemporary King's Landing. We think King's Landing, it's full of Lannister loyalists, it's a Lannister town, because Tywin Lannister was hand of the king for 20 years, and then Cersei was queen, his daughter, so the Lannisters dominate all the offices at the royal court. That we're used to, that so many people there work for the Lannisters, and that historically, and going back for time, that was 300 years after the conquest, and about 200 years after the start of House of the Dragon. That we're used to the Lannisters dominate the royal court. The books say that for the first century of Targaryen rule, between the conquest and the beginning of House of the Dragon, the Lannisters were nothing. They were wealthy, but the Lannisters had no presence at the royal court or in royal politics whatsoever. Neither did, the Starks or the Greyjoys, because they're out in the fringes, but, the Lannisters, who were a relatively wealthy, important house, they had no presence at royal court. That it says the families that were most important at the royal court in the first century, who tended to hold important political offices like on the Small Council, were logically the families that had been most closely allied with the Targaryens during and immediately after the conquest. So, like the Baratheons, who were founded by their bastard half-brother, the Tullys, who had led a revolt in their favor to kick out the Ironborn, that when the Targaryens got to the Riverlands, the Tullys led a revolt to side with them to kick out all the Ironborn and at Harrenhal and everything. So a couple of Tullys were hand of the king. But it was basically Baratheons, Tullys, Velaryons, and Celtigars. It says this in the Lannister chapter of The World of Ice and Fire, explaining why the Lannisters weren't really powerful at first. These were the powerful families. Though, at the start of House of the Dragon, right at this time period, this is when the first Lannister gets appointed to the Small Council, Tyland Lannister. And this is part of a story point, of because he sided with the Lannisters, side with the Hightowers, because they're annoyed at the Velaryons always dominating everything. So you'll see how the political tides are turning. It's what leads to the Civil War. Is there's a court faction and an anti-court faction, and you'll see the first Lannister coming to the small council in this show. So I'm not trying to scare you off of, oh, there won't even be a Lannister in this show. The show starts when the first Lannister comes to the small council because there's a political realignment. But you'll see that. But the backstory they'll talk about is for the past 100 years, the small council's been dominated by Valyrians, Celtigars, Baratheons, and the occasional Tully. Even though the Valyrians and Celtigars are not great houses that rule one of the seven kingdoms, in feudalism, it's not a straight hierarchy of the king at the top delegating things to the great houses below him. That the king's power base is his own royal domains, his own royal lands that he rules directly as functionally his own duke or his own count or something. Like in medieval France, the royal domain lands were around Paris itself, that he was supposed to be the most powerful count, duke of the region of France, though there was some disagreement on that matter. That the TV show never really explained this in dialogue. I checked, they never said the word crown lands in dialogue. It was on maps, that they didn't try to hide that, it just never came up. That the royal domain for the Iron Throne is the crown lands. That there are 9 official administrative regions in the Seven Kingdoms, because it's the original Seven Kingdoms plus the Riverlands, plus the Crown Lands. The Riverlands are a borderland, the Crown Lands are the capital region. That they carved it out from the other seven kingdoms, but the Crown Lands as it exists today is a full administrative region the size of another decently sized one of the seven kingdoms. And it's not just the land around King's Landing like a day's ride, that there's a dozen other major lords directly sworn to King's Landing. There's Dragonstone and the island domains, but on the mainland you have like the Stokeworths. Stokeworths at least showed up on one episode. They're more important in the books. That there's mainland houses in the Crown Lands which are just directly sworn to King's Landing. That there's bits in the mainland. There's bits of these island domains. It's a hodgepodge of a couple of things they cobble together to make a new kingdom. So most important royal officials, particularly in the early days in the 1st century, tended to be lordly houses from within the Crown Lands. These are the people the Targaryens trust the most, their own direct vassals, and this is normal under a feudal system. Even the Starks do that under feudalism. That within the North, which used to be an independent kingdom, but they're functionally still ruling it, on their level as a great house, who are the people that run all the offices at Winterfell, like Captain of the Guards, or the Steward who manages the household logistics, or the Master-at-Arms and stuff? They don't put Umbers and Dustins and Mormonts in charge of these positions. The Starks are themselves the feudal lords of the lands around Winterfell itself, which have their own petty lords directly sworn to Winterfell, the 3rd-tier guys. So they don't have like Umbers and Mormonts holding these positions. They have the local lords from their own domain, like House Cassel and House Poole. And we saw them in season 1. We saw Rory, we saw the Captain of the Guards is from House Cassel. The Targaryens do the same thing, just on the larger level of the royal stuff for the whole realm. But feudal system, the guys from your personal domain, who are houses in their own right. So for the Starks, it's just as the Starks have the Cassels and Pools, the Targaryens have the Valyrians and Celtigars. Whereas the Cassels are minor lords, the Valyrians and Celtigars are major lords. So it's the next step up on a bigger scale. The king rules all of Westeros from his power base in the Crown Lands, and within the Crown Lands, their closest and oldest allies are the Valyrians and Celtigars, who usually served as masters of ship and masters of coin, respectively, and sometimes members of both houses also served as Hand of the King. So these are very close, very old, staunch Targaryen allies of the 2 vassals who came with them, that were already there from Valyria, who support them. And keeping that in mind, section break here, new idea, new topic. The thing is that it was always really fascinating to book fandom, going through all these details. The world building that there are other Valyrian families, just lower ranking ones who didn't have dragons, but who were close allies and servants of the Targaryens themselves. And the TV show put so much focus on this, and the Targaryens are special, they were dragon lords, these guys aren't. I don't think the TV show made it clear that it's like this in the Free Cities too. A lot of people in the Free Cities descend from lower-ranking Valyrian colonists. They mention this, that they are the daughters of Valyria. They were their colonies. I've cited how in the Pentos sections, and also in Fire and Blood when they're talking about Pentos, they repeatedly say, Pentoshi are mongrels. They're lower-ranking Valyrians who weren't dragon lords, who went out to the provinces and miscegenated with the locals. So they're this hybrid culture now. The example is, it's like, think of the Roman Empire. There's the capital city, Rome. Then you have, like, lower-level Roman officials or a minor family that move out to Britannia or something, and they acculturate and hybridize, and they become Romano-British. That's going on in the Free Cities, it's going on in all the Valyrian colonies, and particularly these colonies in Blackwater Bay are at the extreme edge of the Valyrian domain. They are very distant overseas colonies, offshore colonies in another continent. These are trading outposts at the fringe, that they're not like the capital. So I actually don't blame the show for saying, well, the Targaryens are special, they're the last bloodline of Valyria, they're the last dragon lords. All the other dragon lords died, that is true. It's just, other people have a little bit of Valyrian descent in them. Maybe not from dragon lords, not as pure of a bloodline or something. But that's going on in the Free Cities, that's going on here, and it was just fascinating that you going in the books, and they mention it just sparingly, that, oh yeah, we have these two other vassal houses that came with us from Valyria. And that they're not dragon lords and that they're different, and the world building element that there are different tiers to their aristocracy is fascinating, particularly because I'm medievalist and I look at, that's actually what I write on, how the different social classes were arranged in a tiered system, and the different legal status for, I'm a vavasor, but I'm not a full count. But now I have the right to build a castle. Just that is looking at the social structure like that. That there were different strata, different levels, and below even the dragon lords, there was what we might call a minor gentry, of the lesser noblemen, because they don't get as much focus as the main ones. You think about, even in the main novels, most of the POV characters are from great houses or from major noble houses, like even Arya. We don't really get to see what is a minor lordling like, where they're not quite small folk, they're not quite commoners, but they're not a Lannister, they're not a Stark, they're not something on that level. I'm talking about, like, the example I'm dancing around in my mind is, remember the second Duncan Egg novella, if you've read that, The Sorn Sword, where he is just dealing with minor lords, that they have maybe 3 villages they actually rule over. They can put together maybe a dozen men-at-arms. We're talking to the local guy, and it's interesting. Just, well, what's the day-to-day experience on the ground level with these guys? The Valyrians and Celtigars are a bit bigger than that, of course, a bit bigger than what we saw with the Webbers and everything. They are major and wealthy families, but they still don't get as much focus as the Targaryens, who are the ruling family. So just as with real-life kingdoms and empires, where the ruling class can have different tiers, and there's actually things that distinguish them, and the levels of strictness, the higher you go, and it's looser the lower you go, and they differentiate. That's why I actually thought making the TV Valyrians mixed race was a pretty good idea. That we were having problems. We were wondering, how are people going to differentiate the Valyrians from the Targaryens, because they just look like Targaryen light. Oh, we look like the Targaryens, we have ships instead of dragons. Would you do this with their manner of dress to show we're lower ranking guys? And I realized that, a quick and easy, efficient way to do that does serve the storyverse and the world building is to draw the analogy that, well, these colonies on the extreme fringe of the Valyrian domain, this is the edge of their world. This is like Barbados compared to England in a colonial empire. That Dragonstone, Driftmark, and Claw Isle, all the way out there, these distant trading outposts, this was like the Haiti to their France, the Mexico to their Spain, or the Brazil to their Portugal. And that's what happened in these historical empires. When you're at the fringe, you have minor nobles who leave the homeland, leave the capital to go and seek their fortune in the outer provinces. And because they're kind of low-ranking to begin with, they're not as obsessed with blood purity, cultural purity for that matter, and just develop these creolized hybrid cultures out in the periphery, out on the distant overseas colonies, like mixed, like New Orleans or Barbados or something. So I thought that was a good way to distinguish how are these minor Valyrian families out in the provinces different from the Targaryens who were from the capital. Well, they're not as strict with blood purity. They intermarry with local people that are not as strict about that. So I thought that was a good idea, and it helps show social strata much as we would have in a real-life colonial empire, much like they had in the Roman Empire, like a guy out in Britannia or on the fringe of the Rhine frontier, or, fringe near Germany or in North Africa or something, that it's not always like it is in the capital region at the center of culture and power. So the point is, I'm not just excited about the Celtigars as a new house that they're introducing in live action for the first time, who we missed from the books, like the Rowans or the Caswells or something, or the Conningtons or whatever. I'm excited because it's related to the Targaryens and Valyrians. I'm excited that this is an opportunity for world building about the lower-ranking Valyrian families who are below the Dragon Lords, the minor gentry of Valyria. And in turn, that this will provide more context for the Valyrians. I mean, taking as given we've seen, they are race-swapping the TV Valyrians, well, making them mixed race. They have blonde, platinum white hair. Given that they are making that change, they should devote time and energy into setting it up. Part of which is explaining there were other Valyrian families below the Dragon Lords, not just the Valyrians, but here's another one, the Celtigars, and they weren't quite like what the Dragon Lords were like. They were a little more loose about that. If their explanation for the Valyrians is, oh yeah, the lower-ranking Valyrian nobility weren't as strict about this as the Dragon Lords, maybe you should show more than one family from the lower nobility. You have the Valyrians, and the Celtigars will help provide more context for the TV Valyrians. That if you're going to make that change, you better include the Celtigars too, so you can point to another group and say, well, they did that too. Whereas, and people going, oh, how would they intermarry with black people? There are Summer Islander trading ships in every port of the Narrow Sea on a daily basis. And if you read the books, you'd see that the Cinnamon Wind, docking at Bravos, King's Landing, Old Town, Chataya's brothel in King's Landing, which they completely cut, that Summer Islanders are not an unusual sight in King's Landing. I mean, if you saw them walking in the street, you'd go, oh, there's a foreign merchant from the Summer Isles, but you'd see them on a daily basis, because their ships come there all the time. So, the idea of, oh, how would the Valyrians even come into contact with the Summer Islander? Their ships are at their ports on a daily basis. I don't consider that. If you're going to say that they were from Yiti or something, which is their version of China in the Far East, that'll be a little more physically difficult. But how would they meet a Summer Islander? They're there all the time. They were in the books. They got cut out. So if the implication is they want to show the lower Valyrian families weren't as worried about blood purity and would intermarry with surrounding peoples, and I consider the Summer Islanders part of peoples found in the Narrow Sea, because they're there all the time. If the Valyrians intermarried with some Summer Islander merchant princess to get a good trade deal or something, if that's who Corlys's mother is going to be, maybe they could show, to provide context for that, maybe they could show that the Celtigars, like heavily intermarried with the local Andals. Like they mentioned, well, we keep sending tax collectors to the mainland near Claw Island at Cracklaw Point, but they kill most of our tax collectors. Then we realized it was easier to just intermarry with them. Maybe a Celtigar married a local from House Brune or something from Cracklaw Point. So just as apparently the TV Valyrians, so one of them married a Summer Islander, maybe they'll say, oh yeah, the Celtigars are Valyrian, but they don't have silver hair and don't look Valyrian because they've been intermarrying with the Andals for 200 years from Cracklaw Point. And just theorizing on this, like what if the Celtigars, because this is just a soldier, it's not a family member, if they do introduce a Celtigar character, what if they look Caucasian but with brown hair? Or what if they introduce that the Celtigars are gingers? That the Celtigars look like ginger people? And they'll have a point where, like Alicent or something comes to Dragonstone and goes, wait, the Valyrians and Celtigars are Valyrians? They go, oh yeah, well, the Valyrians intermarried with the Summer Islander, and the Celtigars, they got the ginger hair there. They married into Cracklaw Point. Yeah, the lower families weren't as strict about blood purity. Like, that would be an interesting, just to contrast it and explain. The lower ones tended to acculturate wherever they settled because they're these overseas settlers of a colonial empire. That'd be fun. So you have a brief exchange of dialogue where a new person asks Matt Smith's Daemon, hey, why aren't you ginger? He goes, well, because my ancestors cared about blood purity and the Celtigars thought it was okay to marry gingers. So I'm not a ginger. Out here in the overseas colonies, the minor families weren't as obsessed with blood purity as mine were in the capital. Of course, we have no idea just from this spy photo if we'll ever actually see a named Celtigar character, or even if we do, will they have speaking lines, or will they just be glorified extras and Easter eggs? I mean, like Mage Mormont was technically in Game of Thrones Season 1, but she didn't talk. So it's possible this is just heraldry they'll put into crowd shots as Easter eggs, but it's a nice Easter egg to have, if nothing more, but I hope we get more. Like, would there be Celtigar characters to put in from Fire and Blood from this prequel era? Actually, yes. There is a Celtigar character who is part of Rhaenyra's small council, Bartimos Celtigar, that when the Greens stack the small council in King's Landing, Rhaenyra on Dragonstone, when the Civil War starts, she makes her own rival small council. And Corlys Velaryon is her master of ships and hand of the queen. She has her own Queen's Guard because half the King's Guard went with her. And she makes Bartimos Celtigar the master of coin. He's honorable, but he's also really strict. Sort of like Stannis. And a plot point is that Alicent's faction are the party of the wealthy coastal cities. They control King's Landing, Old Town, and Lannisport, that they control most of the wealth, and Rhaenyra is a bit strapped for cash, even with all the Valyrians' money, that Alicent can outspend her and has bigger land armies. Rhaenyra has a few more dragons and control of all the fleets, so she has mobility, but it's not the same. And that's one of our big questions for the show. Will you keep low fantasy concerns that later seasons of Game of Thrones ignored, that, logistics, supply lines, and war debt were key features of what made George R. R. Martin's writing so realistic, the politics of that Rhaenyra is strapped for cash and has the realistic problem of a debt crisis, that in the half of Westeros she controls, the only way she can afford this is to raise taxes, and Bartimos becomes unpopular because Bartimos Celtigar says we just have to raise taxes. We can't afford to pay back for all these armies we're hiring. And because the Greens absconded with the royal treasury. But that's good. It makes Rhaenyra's faction morally gray, and it's a morally gray. It's not good Starks and evil Lannisters. This is like Olenna Tyrell versus Stannis. When you see Alicent's side fighting Rhaenyra's side, it's politics. It's grounded and realistic. So a concern is that money and armies don't just respawn like Dothraki in Season 8. that when you spend all of your money, you'll have to raise unpopular taxes, and this is a problem because then people turn on you. Well, the last interesting point, entirely new point here, last interesting thing about the Celtigars, which I hope we see in the show at some point, and this is just a tiny detail they mentioned once, and a lot of people think it's pretty fascinating just because, oh, that's unusual, is that they have their own ancestral Valyrian steel weapon that said that there's something like 200 surviving Valyrian steel blades in Westeros, and logically they'd be concentrated with an actual Valyrian family who survived the Doom. That the Targaryens have Blackfire, Aegon the Conqueror's sword, and they also have Darksister, the sword of his sister wife Visenya, which was passed down to Daemon Targaryen. So I just made a video where I showed we got our first clear shots of Daemon holding Darksister. The Celtigars have their own Valyrian steel blade, but it's not a sword. It's an even rarer Valyrian steel axe, which is something of an oddity. They point, oh, there's not really that many Valyrian steel axes. That's even rare for Valyrian steel. That there's only 200 of them. They're mostly swords. They have an axe. The books haven't mentioned a name for it, but it's interesting and different. That they are wealthy enough from all the trade they controlled in the Narrow Sea that they could afford a Valyrian steel weapon, and it's an axe. And I hope we see that just to show, there's really, Valyrian steel can be any kind of weapon. I mean, you got great swords like the Stark's Ice that Ned Stark had. You have long swords like Blackfire, bastard swords like Longclaw. You've got daggers, Valyrian steel daggers like the assassin tried to kill Bran with. There's also Valyrian steel araks, probably custom forged in Qohor as tribute to the Dothraki. You got Valyrian steel axes, Valyrian steel tonfas, maces, Valyrian steel glaives, Valyrian steel armor.